It's nice to be here. So let's just take a moment to pray. True God of all truths, how we desire certainty amid the confusion of our lives. We think we could make it if we had just one thing we could know without doubt, one way to be that was not ambiguous, one other we could unreservedly trust. Yet all such knowledge, being and trust too often reflect our desperation rather than your glory. We pray therefore not for certainty, but for joy at the discernment that you have discovered us and given us a way to go in the midst of the confusion. For what more could we ask? Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so I have not done this before on Zoom. I've not given a presentation before on Zoom. So to make me feel better about it, this is the image I've actually got behind you all. Can I have that slide, please? And that would be the next one. Thank you. Next slide, please. There we go. So I'm going to be working out who's who. One before that, Muppet Show one before that. This is going to be interesting, isn't it? That's it. So I'm going to be working out who's who. I've already claimed Miss Piggy, and I'll leave it to you to identify yourselves as we're going along. When I was talking to Alison about this, about what you've been doing over the past few weeks, she gave me a whole list of things that had come up under this topic. Now, given that we've got a very short period of time to cover them, I thought it was important to narrow it down and just look at two. Hopefully you've all received the handouts that I produced actually for my team initially, but I've adapted them slightly to make them more accessible to everybody, which look in more depth at grief and look in more depth at trauma. There's quite a lot of practical ideas in those of how we work with people. So I'd encourage you to read them. They are kind of the background to today's talk. But what we're going to be looking at particularly is ourselves and how we maintain ourselves in the midst of this tsunami of grief and fear and trauma that's coming at us. And certainly within the mental health world, we're expecting it's only going to get worse. So let's think about for a moment where we are. So if we can go on to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs slide, the next slide. Thank you. So this might be very familiar to some of you, but I think it's important to bear in mind that we are actually functioning right down at the bottom in a real way. People are very scared. The environment is not the one that we're used to. We're all having to adapt very quickly. And therefore, actually, what we need to do is just exist. And that's what most of us are doing. We might be shooting up and down the triangle. If you're anything like me, you'll be having moments where actually your esteem needs stroking, or you're starting to write your novel or whatever it might be. But for the most part, it doesn't stay there for long before we go back down. You're listening to the news conference or wherever it might be, or you're doing a funeral or whatever, and it brings us face to face with this very, very difficult circumstances that we're finding ourselves in. So let's move on to the next slide. I found this image really, really useful. Even if you don't have a problem with anxiety, you will be more anxious than normal at the moment. Everybody is. Now, last year within Merseycare, within the trust I work in, the chaplaincy team was put through this options appraisal that was really, really hard. It lasted 4 months. And at the end of it, one of our full-time chaplains was made redundant. So it's a really, really difficult time. And we were all expressing very, very high levels of anxiety. And to a certain extent, we were taking it out on each other. So what I did at this one staff meeting was actually bring in this image and kind of say, okay, so what's happening for each of us? How do we express our anxiety in different ways? And being able to actually name it and to recognize it made us tolerate it more from other people and remember that they're not actually going out of their way to be a pain in the backside. They're actually scared, they're anxious. I mean, my default is I get really stroppy and I cry a lot as well. It makes me a delight to manage, as you can imagine. But both my manager and I recognise that, and being able to recognise that, we know that what I'm actually doing is expressing anxiety. And we're able to address the anxiety rather than necessarily focus too much at that time necessarily on my stroppy behaviour. We all have different ways of doing it, and you'll have your own. If you're not sure what you do, ask the people you live with or who know you best. They'll tell you. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, please. I have recently discovered this lovely book, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse. I just love this image. I wonder how many of us, particularly at the moment, suffer from imposter syndrome. We listen to what other ministers are doing and we feel very inadequate. It might be that the neighbouring circuit are ringing every parishioner, every member every week, or they're writing letters to every member every week, or you know they are doing these all singing, all dancing Zoom services, and we've got writer's cramp and a headache and we're really feeling really fed up. I saw a t-shirt recently that kind of summed it up. I have occasional delusions of adequacy. And that, I think, sums up how quite a lot of us feel. We're just about feeling like we're sort of doing our job, but we wish we could do it better. We just feel unworthy, despite what conference might have said about us. We know the reality of our ministry. And yet this slide reminds us that we don't need to be extraordinary to love. And that's actually what we're called to do. In all of our humanity, in all of our messiness, and all of our screwed upness, we're called to love. And if we're doing that, we're doing our job, we're doing okay. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Just a little bit of science, because I'm a bit of a psychology geek. I started my psychology degree 30 years ago, and I feel like I'm still doing it really, because the whole field is emerging so fast as we get more and more technology. If we could look inside our heads, we would see these really, really funky things called mirror neurons. Now, if you were to open up the heads of most ministers, I think what you would see is some very active and very healthy mirror neurons, because we're pretty good at it. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So what these do is they live in the front part of our brain, the thinking part of our brain, and they allow us to be part of a tribe, to live alongside other people. So we experience what other people experience, which is why if somebody yawns, we feel that we're yawning, we start to yawn too. If somebody starts to giggle, it's really hard not to start to giggle too. It allows that kind of pack communication. What it also does is it allows empathy, and that's really, really significant. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So in allowing for empathy, we learn to experience what other people are experiencing. And there's a really, really interesting psychology study that looks at what happens if, basically the situation was this: a psychology experiment was set up and a whole bunch of people were in a waiting room. What they didn't realise is the waiting room was actually part of the experiment. Never trust psychologists. And what happened is they put in a certain person who was a plant, whose job it was to demonstrate calm, to give off positive vibes, have slow breathing, positive body language. And what they found is that everybody in the room started to echo that behaviour. And I think that's really significant for us at the moment. So the situations that we're going in are very high expressed emotion quite often. But if we can be that person who is mirroring calm, then other people will catch that if they can. Think about Jesus with the woman caught in the act of adultery and think about what he did, okay? So everybody was very heightened. They were up here. They were ready to kill this woman. They were in the fight or flight part of the brain, which is in the limbic system, the back of the brain. It hasn't evolved since we used to run away from dinosaurs. It's, you know, it's what we have carried through, and it's what's kept us alive as a species. But it doesn't think, and it gets caught up in emotion. So everybody's functioning from that part of the brain around Jesus. So what does he do? He literally brings it down, literally right down to the ground. And he starts to engage their curiosity by starting to write in the sand. And what that is doing is getting them out of the back of their brain, the reactive part of the brain, into the thinking part of their brain and bringing it down. So mirror neurons can work in a really, really positive way, but they can also be quite punitive for us as well if we're not careful. I work in a high security hospital. I work in Ashworth. It can be a very intense, occasionally very violent place. And we have a saying amongst the staff that you can't work in a paint factory without being splashed, okay? Inevitably, if we are empathetic people, then there is a risk that we are going to take on too much of the feeling. So let's move on to the next slide. We're looking at vicarious trauma and burnout together. They're a bit different, but the way in which we work with them is very similar. So vicarious trauma is when you become overloaded with what you're hearing and what you're experiencing from the people who are traumatized that you're working with. And what you find is your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors start themselves to express trauma. So you become traumatized by what you're hearing. Burnout tends to be slower. It tends to be that kind of constant chipping away at your defenses that leaves you utterly shattered. You're in freeze mode by that point. So you're in fight or flight mode if you're in vicarious trauma mode. You're in freeze mode when you're in burnout mode. If you think about Elijah sat under the tree, oh, I just want to die. I've had enough. And it can happen to the best of us. It happens, you know, all the time to ministers. So let's move on to the next slide then. So what can we do to support ourselves? Well, I think without healthy boundaries, the bottom line is you will burn out. End of. You've all been hearing this since theological college days. And yet as ministers, we often find it really, really, really hard to protect our boundaries. What I'd like you to think about is why. Is it that you've internalized unhealthy spirituality? What about the covenant prayer? How are you hearing that? How are you using the covenant prayer? Or what about that horrible phrase, God has no hands but our hands? Really? Supposed to be God? Really? That's quite terrifying. Okay. Or something that I've had to address in myself, and I see constantly in the people I work with, nurses, social workers, ministers, lots of us are prone to it, of a narcissistic need to be needed. Now that's quite a tough phrase, but I think that's really, really worth exploring. And it's really, really worth thinking about if you're struggling with your boundaries, whose needs are you actually meeting, your own or the person you're working with? And that might be something that you need to explore with somebody else, because all of us, I think, who work in caring professions, work in caring professions for a reason. And it's because we care, but sometimes we need to think about what's driving the care and why. And that's important. So let's move on to the next slide. Another area that's become a big area of research within psychology is self-compassion. It's relatively new, but what we're finding is that it's far, far more effective than anything else in supporting ourselves and practicing self-care. So there's 3 stages to it. There's mindfulness, so it involves actually being able to sort of take a step away from the feelings and do some wondering and do some questioning what's going on and why. Without judgment, without reacting. There's the self-kindness bit of it, of actually, you know what, I did a really, really, really bad session this week, but it's okay. All the other sessions I did were okay, and I'm going to learn from it, I'm going to get better. Rather than, oh, I'm such a rubbish minister, I don't know why they ever ordained me. We need to think about the messages we're giving ourselves. There's the connectedness bit as well, it's really significant of, I belong to the human race, and as such, I'm human. I'm going to make mistakes, we all make mistakes, and that's okay. If someone was to actually hear the way in which we talk to ourselves, they'd be straight on the phone to the safeguarding officer and reporting us for emotional abuse. Because we have a tendency to treat ourselves far, far more critically than we would anybody else. We can be really horrible and mean to ourselves, and we don't even realise we're doing it a lot of the time. So that's where the mindfulness really kicks in, of stepping out from it and questioning the messages that we're giving to ourselves. Can we have the next slide, please? Those of you who have raised small children or are raising small children will know the reality of this. You would never speak to a small child the way you speak to yourself. But also something to be mindful of with this is not just the way you speak, but the way you structure your life. You're basically a big kid. We're all basically big kids. We all need sleep. We all need to limit junk food. We all need playtime. And if we're not doing any of those things, why are we abusing ourselves? Because we wouldn't do it to a child. Let's move on. Other people really matter within this process as well. Now, I know supervision is a relatively new concept within Methodism. I have 4 lots of supervision a month in different ways and forms. So I have management supervision, I have 2 lots of clinical supervision, and I have spiritual direction every month. So don't moan to me about 1 session a month of supervision. I'm not interested. I think supervision really matters and it's really important. But I'm also really practical about it. If the relationship isn't good enough, and sometimes it's not, then you're not going to feel safe. And if you can't feel safe, then you're not going to share your stories and what's going on for you. So if that's your reality, if that's your experience of supervision, then you need to make sure you've got other people around you who can hold the light for you, but also speak the truth in love. And we all need people who can remind us that sometimes we're the most ridiculous person on the planet. All of us are, at any time. But also can help us to laugh at ourselves, because it's actually one of the most healthy defences is being able to laugh, but also it's one of the quickest to go when we're under stress. So somebody else who can help us to laugh at the situation, laugh at ourselves, is, you know, worth more than money. And I love, again, this image from the book. Sometimes I think you believe in me more than I do, said the boy. You'll catch up, said the horse. It's helping us to catch up with that belief of actually we can become who we are meant to be, and that's all we can ask. Let's move on. I've put this wheel of self-care up for reference. It's not something I want to go into in too much depth today. But what I would encourage you to do is actually really have a good look at it, because it's hard to keep the tension. It's hard to keep a perfect circle. And at any one time we won't be. But it's worth having this on your wall or in your journal or somewhere and thinking, doing a check-in with yourself at the moment when things are quite stressful and weird, and saying, okay, what am I not giving attention to at the moment? And also, if you have a particularly heavy week, think about where you've put all of your attention, where you've put all your energy, and where do you need to then reinvest energy in the coming weeks in order to try and get this balance back again. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Something to bear in mind is it's not a gradual upgoing of ability to do this, ability to do self-care. So let's not beat ourselves up that we're not being very good at self-care, okay? I've certainly heard people kind of say, oh, I'm so rubbish at this. So they start beating themselves up about the fact that they're rubbish at self-care, which is just crazy. It goes up and down. It's the nature of life. We're not going to be reflecting on these slides in the breakout group. I think this is a really individual thing. What I would do is encourage you to have a look at them again and maybe have a conversation with somebody you trust and can hold you to account for where you need to start putting more energy and where you need to start doing some more thought. Okay, let's move on. So we're going to think about trauma now. I want us to think about how we hold it as a church community. Let's move on. This is a phrase I took out of the handout, but just to point out that actually a traumatic incident in itself will not necessarily cause trauma. It's how the person understands and experiences and interprets the trauma that's going to matter to them. So let's move on. Mentioned fight or flight. What we talk about with trauma is the fact that it's expressed in the body, it gets stored in the body. And that's really important because what trauma does is it stimulates all these different parts of our body. And if we can't process it, then it gets stuck there. And the body remembers. It's the name of quite a famous trauma book, but it's true that that's where it belongs, that's where it gets stuck. Let's move on. After a traumatic event, it would be natural for anybody to experience these things, okay? But if people don't have the opportunity to process them properly, then we start to move into post-traumatic stress. And again, some of these things become habitual, they become part of people's everyday lives and they become intrusive, so they're actually inhibiting everyday life. Two things to be particularly aware of in terms of actually identifying somebody who might have PTSD is if they're hypervigilant, so they are very jumpy, they're very aware of any kind of stimuli, but also the nightmares and flashbacks. Because what happens with trauma is this input gets put into the brain really, really quickly. The brain doesn't have a chance to process it properly and it gets fragmented. So the brain, being the very clever thing that it is, tries to integrate all of these experiences. And one of the ways it does that is through nightmares and flashbacks. It's just a way of the psyche trying to process it. So let's move on. I can't say this strongly enough, okay? Pushing people to tell their trauma stories too soon or in too much detail can re-traumatize them. This is really, really, really important, okay? So they have to feel safe, and that can take some time. Again, think about Jesus with the woman caught in the act of adultery. He doesn't take her to one side and says, so I wonder how you feel about the fact that you nearly died by stoning. What he does is he establishes physical safety. So this sense in which actually he stops her being killed, really, really important. But then he establishes psychological, emotional safety as well, in that he turns it around to the people who are about to do the stoning. So it's not just the stones that were going to hurt her, it's the shaming and the public shaming that's hurting her. So what does Jesus do? He says, right, okay, if you're without sin, you can cast the first stone. None of you, off you pop. Psychological safety, it's crucial. If people are going to feel like they can tell you their stories, they're not going to do it unless they feel psychologically safe. Let's move on. So our job when people have got an element of safety and are in a place to actually start telling their stories is to hear them, to hold them, and to reframe them. If we can move on to the next slide. Now, in a sense, we're really lucky in this, almost prophetically. Barbara Glasson, our president of conference, and our VP have effectively made this a year of the story. And we've all been given a copy of their book. Thank you, Auntie Cheryl. I'm sure some of you will too. Barbara, in one of her chapters, reflects on the process of hearing the stories of people who have survived abuse. And she really helpfully points out that we have to respect other people's processes and silences. Some people will never, ever get to the point where they can verbalize their story. And what we're going to find with the current situation is that people who have already experienced trauma in some way, shape or form, and are then traumatized again, either by losing a loved one or working in an ICU or whatever it might be, that story gets layered, that trauma gets layered on, okay, layer upon layer. So it might be that people can't verbalize that. And that's okay, because that's when silence comes into play. And we need to remember the importance of that too. It's not all about words. Let's move on. Trauma and grace in a ruptured world. Serene Jones reflects particularly on her experience of being a minister after 9/11 in the States. But this is her theological reflection on the role of the church within that. So the church is called, as it exists in this space of trauma, to engage in the crucial task of reordering the collective imagination of its people and to be wise and passionate this task. That's our job. We're good at stories. We should be good at stories. Okay, let's move on. So when we're hearing the story, be aware that because of the fragmented nature of how it's stored, you'll be getting different bits of it, or people might be getting different bits of it. What that can mean sometimes is that the person telling their story is disbelieved, because Beryl heard X part of the story and Joan heard Y part of the story, and they were different. So it can't be true because they were making up different parts of the story. Well, actually, no. Because what the person is doing is recalling different bits of the story in different orders and trying to knit them together in a way that is making sense. They're going to need to tell it in different ways and at different times and at different places and more than once. Certainly I found that being able to work creatively with it is really, really helpful, because actually it can be really intimidating to say, oh, so tell me your COVID trauma story. Well, but actually, well, can we write some poetry about this? Or an exercise I've used very effectively is, can we create a fairy tale that tells this story through metaphor? You know, what would COVID be? Would it be the big bad wolf, or would it be this kind of evil killing fog, or whatever it might be? But doing it in a kind of more abstract way can really enable it, and also allow the unconscious to have a voice, which is basically what we're trying to do. Okay, move on. Whoever is hearing the story needs support. So that might be you, that might be your pastoral visitors. So we need to be making sure that people have some sort of supervision, for want of a different phrase, but in a way that is bound, in a way that's confidential, in a way that keeps the person safe. Obviously, it's what we already know, but sometimes we can be really quite bad at within churches. Support groups can be brilliant. It's a way of telling stories to other people who have lived similar stories. But if people haven't had a chance to do much of the emotional work, then actually what it can do is re-traumatize them. So we need to be really careful of that, and we just need to be mindful of the fact that they work brilliantly for some, but not for others. Okay, next slide, please. And this is where our faith starts to get knitted in. So fundamentals of our faith, Serene Jones says, God loves the world and desires us to be met by hope, love and grace, suffering to be met by hope, love and grace. So let's be telling those stories of hope, love and grace, and allowing those stories from our Bible to be intermingled with people's lived stories. But I think the important thing to remember again is to match the person or the people where they're at. Because I think to go straight into the resurrection too quickly, or the equivalent, is not to be respectful of people's processes. So actually there is a time to sit on the floor with them and lament, and that can be really, really important, and that might take some time. Tell stories of resilience. I'm getting really quite frustrated by the message that we're getting, sometimes informally, that our old people are fragile. They're not. There's loads of tough old birds in our congregations, loads and loads of them. So, you know, you think about Captain Tom and his messages of resilience. Let's get people tapping into when they have survived before, when they have really, really risen to the challenge or not, been crushed, but then got up again. All those stories of resilience are important, and they provide a framework in which there's that promise that we're going to get through this as well. I love this phrase from Maya Angelou because I think it sums up the whole aspect of what we're trying to do with trauma. History, despite its wrenching pain, if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And it's helping people to face it with courage. That's what we're trying to do. Next slide, please. I just want to draw for a minute on the Jewish tradition, because I think the Jewish tradition of the Jews have really, really nailed this. They've got it down to a fine art. They are fabulous at telling stories, and stories are an integral part of their faith, their practice, everything. And I really loved this. When I Googled Passover, a page came up, freedom in body and soul. Now we're bearing in mind that trauma is stored in the body. So actually what we're trying to do is release the trauma from the body as much as from the soul and as much as from the spirit and the psyche. And one of the particularly effective ways that the Jewish people have found of doing this is by having the Seder plate with the Passover meal. Now, if you don't know about the Seder plate, it engages all the senses. So you've got bitter herbs, you've got salt water that represents tears, you have got this sweet stuff that represents the clay in the buildings they were creating. It's engaging all the senses, it's engaging the body in really quite a clever way. Something we can perhaps learn from, and something we'll reflect on a bit later. Next slide, please. Just before I end this presentation and we go into breakout groups, I just want to leave you with this poem. God speaks to each of us as he makes us, then walks with us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear. You send us out beyond your recall. Go to the limits of your longing. Embody me. Flare up like a flame and make big shadows I can move in. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is the country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand. And I just want us to carry that out from today, from after our discussions, that no feeling is final. God offers us a hand and leads us forward through this. We're not on our own. So let's make sure we're remembering that. Okay, so we're going to go into breakout groups now. Apparently these slides are going to be made available to you, and there's also a reading list at the end of them as well, if you want to kind of take it off and do some more study around it. And I'm going to hand over to the facilitators to help us with the next bit.
Thank you so much, Karen. I've been getting messages from people saying this is brilliant presentation, and thank you so much. So thank you so much from everybody. And if you don't know how to do the clapping, you can do the clapping by clipping reactions, and then there's two little hands together and we can give you a silent round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for pitching that really helpfully for the context that this group of people are in. Karen mentioned some handouts which we'll get to you afterwards as well, because I think I just need the updated version of those, and we'll get the PowerPoints to you all as well. So thank you all for a bit of patience on that. And Karen's session was recorded, or in fact we're still recording. We're going to put that on our